All right. So I think, we all know that AI is going to have a huge impact on our world today. And a lot of us, when we think about AI, we think about technology. And obviously, this is an exciting time for technical progress. But before we realize AI is going to have a huge impact on our economy, our jobs, how things get done, it's also going to have a huge impact on our society. After a really long time, we will be forced to look at our values and really think about what's fair and what's not. Like the excellent talk by Dr. Tang, it's very difficult to define fairness in mathematical terms, right? After all, it's a subjective thing. So we are forced to look at ourselves and say, okay, if we're going to automate a lot of the decisions that impact our life, how can we make it where it's fair and it's responsible? So I'll be talking about a few of these concepts. Now, how many of you have been in a job interview in the last couple of years? Okay, so many of you, like myself. And just think about it, instead of a real person, if you had a bot or an algorithm interviewing you, assessing your words, and even analyzing your facial expressions, and saying, comparing that with the top performers within the company that you're interviewing for. This is not theory, this is real. There is a company called HireVue which does that. And guess what? The top performers in whatever company it goes to are mostly people that belong to a certain type of group, right? And if it's interviewing someone, for example, I came to the US as a foreign student. And it took me a while to understand the lingo and the culture and everything, right? And I wasn't speaking that much. So the algorithm could completely interpret it as someone who's not confident enough, doesn't know what their topic is, and that could be wrong. So the idea is that we are making assumptions and we are doing things without really knowing their impact. So the one takeaway I want you to take from this talk is that you don't have to be technical to understand the impact and do something about it, right? So I know many of you are probably very deeply technical, but over this talk, I'll make a point that there's more than technology to solve this problem. So I just put a collage together of various things, various articles in the media. I think over the last year and a half, this topic has grown in frequency. More and more attention is getting to it, which is good, except that there are also some people who are looking for opportunities to sue companies to make some money. So that's the negative thing. There's some books in there. There's some studies about gender and shade and facial recognition. Some articles from Wall Street Journal about policing with artificial intelligence, and all kinds of those. And the guy in there in front of the computer, he's testing the automated interviewing system. So there's a lot of talk about it, which is great because you always want to start with awareness before you actually get to doing something about it. If most citizens don't know about it, then there's a problem, because as you realize, regulation is not something that the industry wants, but that's where we are going. Just yesterday, there was a congressional hearing about ethical AI and how to manage this. So in today's talk, I want to talk about the power and perils of AI. Along with these great advantages that AI gives us, there are also some issues. I also want to talk about what's happening today in terms of the impact and what are these black boxes that we have to deal with, and then talk about some related concepts. Privacy is something that we all have a good idea about, but maybe the next generation has a different attitude towards it, and that's something that we need to look at. A little bit about the reasons. I think it was already covered in the previous talk, so I'll kind of go fast over it. And then a few things that as a citizen you can do to counter this work. The picture at the top right is interesting because if you have heard about the use of AI in China, you may have heard that they have the most data and the most pervasive use of AI in anywhere, right? So US is not even close. So there is the largest insurance company there uses your facial expressions to identify you as well as to figure out if you are a fraud or not. So that's sort of the scores and all that. And we'll come back to the test audit that a researcher did on various facial recognition systems in terms of its accuracy rates for different demographic groups. This is one of the best videos out there if you are interested in learning about the topic of what's wrong and how bad is it to have bias in these kind of systems. Kate Crawford of AlNow Institute, she's a professor at NYU and a researcher at Microsoft. They have done extensive studies, and I'll be happy to share this deck and link with you so you can watch it. But the point she makes is that in our history, we have never done this massive thing before. We're taking the largest data sets ever and doing classifications on it. We are putting people in different buckets and saying, you belong to this, you're good, you're bad, you're this, you're that. And we are doing it without really understanding the flaws and the limitations of the data, the bias, and our own thinking. So DARPA had a challenge out there a couple of years ago, giving funding to any researchers and people who can look at the whole idea of how do you explain what's happening with the modern AI. When I say modern AI, I talk about deep learning. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but just to level set, today's deep learning models, such as the ones that are used in self-driving vehicles, they are very complicated systems. They probably could be 30, 40 models all combined together, and each model can have hundreds of layers and millions of these elements called neurons connected to each other. So when Uber has an accident and somebody gets hit, it's not always easy to go back and say, this is why it happened. We think we know, but we're not sure. And when you have these kind of black boxes, you cannot trust these models. And self-driving vehicles are a little bit down the road, but there's stuff that's happening today, right? All of you are carrying phones which have AI embedded in it. So every time you search, you try to translate something, the modern search engines are giving you results based on that data, and there's always evidence that some of those were biased. So even companies with huge sets of data and access to a large set of talent, they were blindsided and they were caught on the wrong foot. So media is now picking up, and those things are coming in the media, and we should kind of pay attention to that because it's going to start impacting us. So in terms of the explainable AI, I think I'm using these slides directly from DARPA, but they're really interesting in terms of being able to explain through an interface and then communicating that result back to you. For example, if you apply for a loan, you should be able to know why you were rejected. Similarly, if you are, if some of your transactions get rejected because the AI thinks that there is some suspicious activity, it needs to provide you some more information so that you understand it. And as we go towards autonomous AI, and that's sort of the next cherry on the cake thing, where we don't want to teach models with large sets of data, we want them to learn by themselves, it becomes even more critical, right? And as you can see, some of the the things, whether we like it or not, can affect human lives. So in the last talk, you already covered a number of different approaches where sometimes you take protected attributes like gender and race and move them out. You don't even consider them. Sometimes you consider them, but you force that each group will have similar number of false positives or not. None of these approaches are a silver bullet. You have to look at the data, and you have to look at the distribution of the data and then decide what's a good approach. So sensitivity analysis or layer-wise relevance will only help you once you figure out what you're doing. And here is the interesting thing. What's happening today is the models that perform the best are the ones who have the least explainability. That's the tension. If you use a classical machine learning model like logistic regression, it will have probably lower accuracy, but it will give you better explanation of how certain variables are affecting the result. That's why in regulated industry like finance, you will see that that's a very common approach of not using a black box like a deep neural network and using the other approaches, because eventually, they have to go back and justify if someone complains. Now let's come to privacy, right? And I was looking at a webinar and saw this interesting quote, so I took a screenshot. I think that, a lot of us intuitively know how much power data has, but we probably don't want to know exactly how it's impacting us. So someone was complaining that, they were trying to book an air ticket, and they did it from their MacBook, and then they went back maybe 2 hours later, and it quoted them a higher price. Do you think it's just incidental? No, because all of the exhaust data from your browsing, like you said yesterday, they're looking at you using a MacBook, you're using Safari, and you're coming back to that again, and they have all of the cookies data. So they probably know a lot about you, and they're saying, okay, you should pay more. So that's just one example, but if we don't pay attention to privacy, it's going to be a major problem for the tech companies and for us. Why? Because we already have GDPR in Europe, and that's causing some pressure on companies everywhere. But if the companies don't really give us control over our data, there will be a backlash, and it can be political. So right now, as it's common, government is just struggling with policy, right? US had its first AI policy defined in 2016, then revised, then 2018, and then just last week there was a revision to that. And other countries like China, France, Canada, they're way ahead, right? So they will probably come up with some regulation that will make it harder. But today, you realize that just a handful of companies control most of the data. And it's our data, but it's used to monetize. So I think it's very unfair, and it's time for us to take control back. You'll see that challenge. The other challenge with the AI are the deepfakes, right? Everybody has heard about deepfakes? Yes? So these are essentially fake videos or pictures, or you can apply it to text, audio, or pictures and video. So pretty much you can create a fake audio of anyone, and you will be unable to distinguish from the actual one. And that's obviously, you can just realize how that can be abused. But already, you saw a lot of issues with the last time we had elections. So just think about next year how bad it can be. And here's the bad news. Really, we don't have a technical solution to this. So over time, eventually, media is probably going to have different kinds of solutions. Maybe they will add digital certificates or, other approaches. But for now, the same technology that's being used for very good purposes can also be used for very nefarious purposes. So why do we have this kind of bias, right? We heard about the data part, right? So I'm not going to go over it again, but obviously, if you collected data for some purpose and use it for another purpose, or you were lazy in collecting data and you only collected it from one population, and now you're trying to apply it to a different population, all of those problems with data exist. And then there's sometimes algorithmic bias, right? There's something in your logic that's causing that. But the third one is even more important, because over time, we have developed some biases that today are getting reflected in both the data and algorithms, and we're not able to always say that, admit that, right? But every one of us will have some sort of bias based on how our minds work. And that's where we need to pay attention. And that's actually, whether we like it or not, that gets reflected in data. Even if you have the most perfect data, it will have traces of that kind of human bias. So one thing that I'm recently looking at, it's very interesting, is just medical data sets, right? A lot of medical studies are done and the results are shared with the public saying, hey, this study just found that 80% of the people have this kind of problem. Well, if you look closely, most of the data is only collected from a certain kind of population. So in this article from Quartz, it's pointing out that problem. It makes sense because, for these studies, researchers go out to some research firms and say, find us people with these kind of problems in these cities, on these, so, they will go and try to recruit these people for studies, and it's easier to find people who are from a dominant group. In this case, they found that Black Americans don't usually participate in that study, so most of the data that's collected doesn't really apply to them. Same thing to other populations like Asians or Hispanics. So this is something that's a huge problem, and it impacts all of us, because when the recommendations come, they're usually lumped all together, and in general, we don't question that, but that's how we have this impact of bias in it. So as we go along, we need to kind of figure out better ways to do that. A lot of research is going on in that area, like the gender shades by this Joy and Timid, and then approaches to algorithmic bias. So it's a very active area, but there's still a lot of debate. So we should keep an eye on it, but along with that, there is a need for a wider group of people to get involved. So as I mentioned, the one takeaway from this should be it's not just a technical problem. It is essentially a social problem, and you need people with diverse backgrounds and a lot of different expertise. This is a screenshot from the website of Algorithmic Justice League, ajlunited.org. And they've made a nice graphic of how different people from different backgrounds should do different things to affect that. So this was the hearing, congressional hearing that I was talking about. There is actually a video of this, so you can kind of hear. So eventually, we will see some movement in this, although I think they are like 2-3 years behind. So in conclusion, there's some recommendations, and you don't need to really worry about trying to copy this, because I wrote a blog post and I added a lot of references. So I'll share this deck, and the link is there. So you can see the recommendations. The key thing is that, if you work for a company or any kind of organization, you should tell the decision makers that this is important, and there has to be some sort of governance and overview of what your organization is doing with AI, ML, starting with data part, right? So first of all, there has to be that awareness, and if the board members or if the key decision makers understand that, they'll be in a much better position to do something about it, right? And you have to invest in this in terms of your time and effort, recently there was a big grant by Stephen Schwarzman of Blackstone to Oxford to do this kind of study. And a lot of schools are realizing that the curriculum that they have, they need to expand it to include more social scientists and people from different backgrounds so that they can get all these perspectives. And as you do that, most of the organizations will come up with some code of ethics. Already, like Microsoft's, AI's, Amazon's, they've learned from experiences. They've, Amazon rolled back their automated hiring system, which was scanning resumes and rejecting women at a disproportionate rate. So that's something that they already, rolled back because they realized it just doesn't work. But even if you're not like that company, you still probably have a lot of data at your company and organizations. As you use it, it's good to have some sort of a group that looks at the best practices and makes sure that you're compliant with that. And it's not just something that you do because you want to feel good. Biased models are bad for business, bad for your brand reputation. If there are cases that are discovered and shared, your customers are probably not going to feel good about it. So instead of being, reactive and waiting for something to happen, just like companies have done with cybersecurity, my recommendation is that, you be proactive, get ahead of it, and put some guardrails around your AI ML initiatives so that, you don't have to go back and redo a lot of work about what happened and what went wrong. So I'll open it up for questions. I'm sure there are thoughts and questions. I think in terms of time, we have a few minutes. So you're welcome to share with any questions here as well as later on. I'll be around. No questions? I'm sure there are some questions. David?
So where would you say we're at on the continuum of development on explainable AI? Are we in the infancy stages, or where are we at?
Yeah, I think we're in the early stages. There's some good improvements. I've seen some research work happen. I've seen some real interesting visualizations of deep neural networks, where as you progress through the layers, you can start seeing how the features are detected and how that. But I still think it's mostly a playground for researchers, and it's harder for business teams to really grasp that. But I'm sure that within the next few years we'll have much better results. And there's a lot of work that's going on. So I'm sure somewhere along that you'll get a good breakthrough.
For those who are challenged with a motor disease, in the case of the subway jerky ball, how would you mitigate the risk of not selecting a qualified candidate for a position based upon the candidate's ability to express themselves appropriately?
Absolutely.
For example, a person with Parkinson's disease may be subject to muscular facial spasms which may prevent the ability to smile or keep their eyes open for an extended period of time.
Yes. So I think companies should be very careful, but there's already regulation. I think one state has banned the use of these algorithms and bots to interview because of this exact same reason. So if the companies don't act now, there will be regulation, and then that will stifle innovation. So I think it's better to self-regulate and use your common sense. That's why awareness is important. Maybe somebody at these companies thought that it was really cool to kind of, because the reality is hiring is broken, right? People are frustrated when they're applying, and then, when people are hiring, they don't find the good matches. So it's a problem that has to be solved, but today it's kind of not working. Yes.
Today's industry with AI, with bias and things like that, a lot of these conferences you hear a lot about the bias in them. the Googles of the world, the Facebooks of the world have the resources to study bias and make sure they get it out if they want to. However, with the fierce competition with the advancement of AI, small companies do not have the resources and they need to be first to market. How do you mitigate, hey, I need to be out there, I need to put a product out, or I'll be out of business, versus, hey, let's put a team together and let's study the underlying symptom. Where is the balance between that?
So for smaller companies, you don't really need to do cutting edge research. There are enough best practices out there. So you just apply those starting from the data side, right? So in my blog, I have a checklist of just basic things, right? And your data scientists or machine learning engineers probably know about it. You just have to encourage them. Hey, did you do all of this? And are we good? And the good practice, for example, is to have a model governance committee that includes people from business, product, legal, technology. And you review your models and the data. And you say, okay, did we do all the basic things? Because if you do that, you're already ahead of a lot of companies who aren't even thinking about it, right? It also depends on the culture, right? If somebody says, hey, is this our model fair? And the other people say, hey, don't even talk about it because we have a delivery date. We're not going to stop to look at all these other things. We just want to deliver and move on. That's a whole different way of thinking. So the first thing is change your thinking and put some basic checks behind it.
I wanted to ask, first of all, Babar, thank you for the presentation. For those of us that are local to Dallas, we know Babar has Dallas AI and he's the AI expert locally in Dallas. I wanted to ask, as it relates to the topic of ethical and fair AI methods and you being the AI expert, what keeps you up at night?
Well, I think that there's sort of a gold rush to model human behavior and then just introduce different kinds of products and solutions without really understanding. And we have this dichotomy of trust. On one side, we don't trust models. On the other side, if an app tells us something, we feel like there's data behind it. There's something behind it, so we should trust it. So I think probably all of this in this room, we can probably make a good judgment. But maybe, for people who are the next generation, they are sometimes trading privacy and all that to get something in terms of their social connections or things. So they may have a disproportional impact. So I think for our next generation, we need to kind of get them involved and have them realize that these things will matter, even if you think that today it's not a big deal. So that's what I'm worried about that, and I'm worried about the geopolitical race of, hey, we need to get ahead in AI, so let's just take something that was done in country X and apply it to country Y. While it doesn't work like that. These are not portable things that you move and just plug in and start working on it. It's a very messy process, and today it's the media portraits a very romantic picture of, hey, we did AI, we did all this great stuff, and happily ever after. That's not the reality. All right, thank you.